He was a civilian truck driver. And at first he worked at Cleveland Graphite Bronze. He and my mother both. He was a welder and my mother was a bearings inspector. However, due to the fact that everything was done in cash, payrolls were cash. And one night my father went out after his shift around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and he was attacked and robbed and left in the car unconscious with the doors open. It was the middle of winter, and my father got pneumonia and could no longer work in a factory. So he became a truck driver for Ed Keel Driveway Company. And they were located on 89th Street near the Shoreway, right near the White Motor Plant. They drove most of the brand new White Motor trucks that were involved in the World War II to both coasts, East Coast and West Coast. And my dad was a convoy leader and making sure that some 20 trucks at a time and 20 drivers besides himself got to each coast safely, on time, and he handled all the money for the meals, the stopovers, whatever they needed, and then the trains, the train fare back. He came back by airplane, and he had a paper that said he had top priority on an airplane. And one of the stories he told when he came home was that he had gone to the airport, gave him his paper and everything, and he said, you know, how soon would I go back? And they said, well, we have a plane leaving in about a half an hour. And he said, great. And he went and sat down. The next thing he heard on the loudspeaker was, would General so-and-so come to the counter, please? And he's sitting there listening. And the girl said, General so-and-so, you're being delayed. We had to give your seat to someone else. And the general got out. Of course, you know, 5-star general, they're all huffy and everything. And he said, I've got to be in Washington. I've got to this. I've got to that. And she said, I'm sorry. We have a priority passenger who has higher priority than you do. And he said, well, I want to meet this person. And so she looks at my dad's, you know, what's this all about? She said, Mr. Semple, would you come up here, please? And she introduced them. And he said, how does he get top priority over me? And she said, he's a convoy leader that's taking the trucks to the coast to ship overseas to Japan or to the East Coast for Europe. And he said, he turned to my dad and he said, God love you. We appreciate you so much.
What years was your dad doing this?
He started approximately 1943, and he worked for Keel until his death in 1963.
Nice story. Do you remember him being gone?
Oh, yeah. Because he had to be gone, my mother quit her job at Cleveland Graphite Bronze, and we lived over a what they attractively called at that time a beer joint. It was called Molly's Lounge at that time, or just Molly's, and we lived upstairs of it, so my mother was a waitress down in there so that she could be with us. But of course, most of the time she worked at night. And my brother and I were upstairs, and we would, you know, crawl out of bed and listen to the radio. And we heard all of the broadcasts from Europe because they came they came in later in the evening. They didn't come in at, you know, something like 7 or 8 o'clock. But we had gotten into that habit when my parents were on the swing shift at Cleveland Graphite Bronze. So I was about 5 when Pearl Harbor happened, and I was 10 when the final armistice was declared. So it's those little tiny things, scrap drives, We'd get a wagon or some kind of wheeled vehicle, and we'd go all over the neighborhood in the empty lots picking up metal. And there was a factory just down the street from us, and we'd go back behind it, and one of the fellows came out and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we got a scrap drive." And I'm just a little tiny thing, and I'm bold as brass. "Well, we're picking up metal for the scrap drive." And he said, "Oh, okay." And he called another fellow and talked to him for a minute, and out they came, and they loaded that thing sky high. And we took it off to the scrap drive. The other thing they did was when you cooked anything that had grease coming from it, you put it into a can on the stove. And periodically, when you got a full can full, you took it to the local grocery store, and they gave you a couple of cents for it. But then they added it to all of their suet and fats so that it would go into the war effort, because I think that was to make soap and glycerins and things like that. And they wanted that rendered down fat. So we would take that all the time. We had, sometimes we had air raid practice. It wasn't very often because, of course, the United States never thought they would be attacked, and they weren't, except in the Aleutians in Alaska. But they still had us, going to the center, almost like a tornado. And so the kids wouldn't get upset, they said, "Well, we have bad weather too," and that was at Waring School, which was on 31st, just off of Payne. And that's where I spent the first couple of years.
You brought an interesting memento.
Yes, rationing. A lot of people remember rationing and don't remember rationing. Gasoline was rationed, and you got a sticker for your car, and depending on how much gas you were allowed, you had a letter on it. And I think an A was the top priority. Well, my dad had an A. And you would go to the gas station, you'd give them the book, and they would give you your allotted amount of gas, and they'd tear out the coupon that went with it, and then they'd give it back to you. And in the stores, you had sugar, butter, meat, things that were not easily available and that took freighting to come in and stuff like that wasn't, really local. And they had a ration book. And you had so many points for X amount. And they were dated so that you could have X amount, I believe it was a month. Like maybe you could have 5 pounds of sugar for a month. Now, in this day and age, you use 5 pounds of sugar, in a week. But depending. It's coming back down again. But I remember the meat mostly because you had, and the ration books had different colors for each item. And meat, of course, was red. And that included chicken and pork. But it was red anyway. And if you had meat that you were purchasing, you gave them the book, and they looked at it, and the meat you were purchasing might have been 8 points. But your coupon was for 10 points. So what they did was they gave you these little tiny points for the difference. It was like having change for your ration book. And I came across it recently in I had bought some buttons, and it was in amongst these buttons because they were antique buttons. And I hadn't saved any from when I was a child. I tried, but that's too many years ago. But when I saw it, I looked at it and I thought, no, can't be possible. So I got a magnifying glass out, and I looked at it and I said, sure enough, it's a 1 point red meat. And it says OPA on it, which was the pricing agency at that time. And they handled all the rationing of everything. So that's going into some of my mementos now, and into some of my, along with some of my pictures.
What do you remember? You were a child during the war. Were you fearful? Were you? Did you understand what was going on?
Children weren't. At that age, even my brother was 4 years older than me, and he understood war. We went to the movies. We would see the movie tone news, the eyes and ears of the world, and saw pictures. I think the most devastating pictures I saw that upset me the most, and at that point I was 10 years old, was the Holocaust ovens and the camps they went into, and the pictures of those people. That was horrifying. The pictures of the Japanese prison camps. That was horrifying. That, I think, upset me as a child and friends of mine the most. Seeing planes dropping bombs, I mean, we were seeing movies made up of these people that were doing that. A Wing and a Prayer, and Coming Home, and the ones from England with their hardships. I grew up in a slum. That, to me, that was almost normal. And we didn't have that much. So, but the bodies, that was devastating, because those were things that we had not really seen. We had seen a little bit of death, but that's glamorized because of the cosmeticians and things like that. You go to a funeral home, they're peaceful, they look good. You go to a newsreel, and you see them all broken up and in ditches and just thrown together in skin and bones. That I remember vividly.
What did you think when you'd see those? Do you remember? Did you understand it? Or?
Oh, yeah. That I understood. Well, I was 10 years old then, and that I understood. And I thought that, how could anybody do that? Anybody? How could they be so cruel? And you saw some of the some of the captured things from Germany, and saw the Nazis standing over some of these people. And at that time, I didn't know that I had a Jewish background. None of the family did. But my great-grandfather was born in Jerusalem of a converted to Christianity Jewish father. So I think I would have been absolutely devastated if I had known that at that time. And I can't imagine what the people in the United States went through that had relatives there. My mother's mother had relatives there. She was from Poland. And one of her sisters spent the entire war in a potato root cellar. And that was all they had left. And trying to make ends meet, and eating roots and grass to stay alive. And we got that from letters. None of those letters were in Polish, and none of them have survived, which I'm terribly sorry about. But it was horrible. And those are the things I remember about World War II. I remember some of the fun things too, but
like what?
Well, we would still celebrate parties. My dad's parents had rented a piece of a farm in Medina, and we would go there, relax a little bit. My uncles shot. One of the youngest brother was in the service in Europe. Fortunately, he came back. Since then, I have found out that my second cousins, my grandmother's sister's children, most of them were in the war. My cousin Marty was in the waves, and her husband was in the Air Force. They met and got married after the war. Her other cousins, I have a second cousin, Bill Fraley, who still is in Piedmont, California, where he grew up, and he was in the Air Force. And he remembers coming back on leave and seeing my grandfather, and it was very early in the morning, and he didn't have very long, but my grandfather was drinking coffee, and he said, he said it was so funny and so old-fashioned. He said, there he was pouring coffee into the saucer, blowing on it, and then drinking it. And that's some of the things he remembered, and he has passed on to me. Things at school. I mean, school was ordinary. Most of our life was ordinary. But hearing about telegrams coming, my grandmother got one when my Uncle Murph was shot, and he was in a hospital in England. And the devastation, I mean, you just, of the soul, that when they got that, they didn't know until they opened it up, what did it actually say? Most of the time, part of the time, officers were sent if it was a death. But when it got to be so many, they couldn't do it. So you got a telegram. The people that worked at Western Union, I don't know how they handled it because they had to deliver those. But we had fun on the farm, and we had a swimming hole, and we were kids. And it just, most of it didn't seem real. It bypassed us, really. So there's just certain things I remember.
Did you realize at the time that you were proud of your dad, or was that when you became an adult and you realized what he was doing? And that in real time, did you recognize the work your father was doing and feel proud, or was it only when you became an adult and you thought, how significant the work he was doing was?
Well, I think about the time I was 15, it really sunk in. Mm-hmm. But that was because of another war and another situation that you don't need to hear about because you're focusing on World War II. But I knew that he was a truck driver. I knew he was gone. I knew he was into the war effort. And it just seemed like everybody was doing whatever they could. The woman next door, if my mom had to go somewhere or something like that, the woman next door had two girls. She would keep an eye on us. We had a social settlement house, which we don't have anymore. They call them rec areas now or something. And it was Goodrich Social Settlement House, and it was on 32nd near St. Clair. Sterling Park was across from it. And we went there, and that was our after-school stuff because it kept us occupied. It kept us off the streets. When you're in the city, you either do that or you get in trouble. You either stay home, which if nobody was there, you didn't stay home. And my brother was playing sports and stuff at that time, so I went in and I was doing carving of bracelets, clay, work with clay, singing, things like that. So they kept the kids as occupied as possible, and whole communities would help each other. It's nothing that you see today except in isolated areas. In the city, you don't know your neighbor. Sometimes in the country, you don't know your neighbor. But it just seemed like the schools were open to having after-school activities. The stores, if you went in and walked around, they didn't shove you out or say, what do you need? Or they weren't on top of you all the time. Movies, for my age were only 2 cents. Can you believe that? And they had, I think, 3 pricings. One was that if the child was carried, they were free. Mm-hmm. But up to, I think, 7, it was 2 cents. And then you had a junior price that went from, or it might have been 10, up until about 15, 16 was a junior price, and then the rest was adult. But every Saturday we went to the movies, and of course that's where I saw the Movie Tone News, and of course the cartoon, and various types of movies that you had your serial, your Masked Man, and Rin Tin Tin serials, and your Pearl Buck, takeoffs, things like that. But you usually had at least once a month you had a war picture. And several of them stick in my mind. One of them was after the war, and it was called Purple Heart. And I understand it was based on a true story. And those men never came back. They got it. I think the original story came from someone in the prison camps and from the court records that they found in Japan. But it was very poignant. So, what else would you like to know?
I do need my name is, and I live in.
My name is...
are you ready? Back there? Just say my name is, and I guess I need to rephrase this because this is set for military. So my name is, I live in, and I was my father worked in the war effort. We need to think of some way or she can just say her name instead of, do that. My name.
How old were you when the war was going on?
Yeah.
I was 10 years to 15 years, or however old.
I was 5 to 10, 5 when it started and 10 when it finished.
Okay, so yeah,
Okay, good.
if you just put that at, so you say my name is, where I'm from, and I was 5 at the beginning, 10 at the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Barbara Semple-Shaver. I live in Uniontown, Ohio, and during the war, I was 5 when it started. I was 10 when it finished. Spent all of that time in Cleveland, Ohio.